Story 1. The Woman Who Walked Backwards. Sarah Mitchell had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for 3 weeks when she encountered something that would fundamentally alter her understanding of reality. A seasoned hiker with 12 years of experience, she had completed sections of the trail in previous years and was now attempting a through hike from Georgia to Maine. It was mid-October 2019 and she was making her way through the dense forests of southwestern Virginia, about 40 miles south of Pearisburg. The day had started normally enough. Sarah woke at dawn in her tent near a small creek, boiled water for her freeze-dried breakfast, and packed her gear with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. The weather was perfect for hiking. Cool, crisp air with patches of fog clinging to the valleys below. She estimated she would cover about 15 miles that day, reaching the next shelter well before dark. Around noon, she stopped at a rocky outcrop to rest and eat lunch. The trail had been moderately challenging that morning with several steep inclines, but nothing beyond her capabilities. As she sat on a flat boulder eating her trail mix and jerky, she noticed the forest had become unusually quiet. No birds sang. No squirrels rustled through the leaf litter. Even the wind seemed to have stopped completely. That's when she first saw the woman on the trail below her vantage point. She appeared to be in her 30s, wearing what looked like hiking clothes from several decades ago. Faded blue jeans, a red flannel shirt, and old leather boots. But it was her movement that immediately struck Sarah as wrong. The woman was walking backwards up the trail, moving with perfect confidence despite not looking where she was going. Sarah called out a greeting, but the woman didn't respond or acknowledge her presence in any way. She simply continued her backward progression up the mountain path, her feet finding purchase on rocks and roots without any apparent difficulty. Sarah watched, transfixed, as the woman moved with an unnatural smoothness, almost gliding over obstacles that should have tripped her. Unnerved but curious, Sarah decided to pack up her lunch quickly and continue hiking. She told herself there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps the woman was doing some kind of training exercise, or maybe Sarah had misperceived the direction she was actually traveling. But as Sarah descended from her rest spot and rejoined the main trail, she found herself about 100 yards behind the backwards walking woman. For the next 2 hours, Sarah followed at a distance, unable to look away from the bizarre sight. The woman maintained the same steady backward pace, never turning around, never stumbling, never slowing down. Sarah tried calling out several more times, even speeding up to try to close the distance between them. But the woman stayed exactly the same distance ahead, as if she were somehow aware of Sarah's position and adjusting her speed accordingly. The trail wound through increasingly dense forest, and the afternoon light began to take on a strange quality. Too dim for the time of day, filtered through the canopy in odd, angular shafts. Sarah noticed that her GPS unit was acting erratically, the signal flickering in and out even though she'd had solid reception all morning. Her compass began spinning slowly, unable to settle on north. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah realized something even more disturbing. The woman's footprints, or rather, lack of them. The trail here was soft with fallen leaves and damp earth, and Sarah's boots left clear impressions with each step. But when she looked at the path where the woman had walked, there were no prints at all. It was as if she weighed nothing, or perhaps wasn't touching the ground at all. Sarah's rational mind struggled to process what she was witnessing. She stopped walking, bending down to examine the trail more closely. Her own prints were clearly visible, but where the woman had been, the leaves were undisturbed, still covered in morning dew in perfect formation. A cold dread began spreading through Sarah's chest. When she looked up again, the woman had stopped. She stood about 50 feet ahead on the trail, still facing away from Sarah, completely motionless. For several long minutes, neither of them moved. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, and she realized her hands were shaking. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around and run, but she felt frozen, unable to look away. Then slowly the woman began to turn. Not her body, just her head. It rotated impossibly, far beyond the range of human anatomy, continuing to turn until she was looking directly at Sarah while her body still faced the opposite direction. Her face was pale, almost luminescent in the dim forest light, with eyes that were completely black. No whites, no irises, just endless darkness. Sarah finally found the ability to move. She stumbled backward, her backpack throwing off her balance, and she fell hard onto the rocky trail. Pain shot through her hip and elbow, but she barely registered it. She scrambled to her feet, turned, and ran back down the mountain the way she had come. She ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. She didn't stop until she reached the creek where she had camped the previous night. Only then did she dare to look behind her. The trail was empty. The forest sounds had returned, birds chirping, leaves rustling, the normal ambiance of the Appalachian wilderness. Sarah set up her tent right there, even though it was only mid-afternoon. Her hands shook so badly she could barely manage the tent poles. She crawled inside and sat there, hugging her knees, trying to convince herself that she had experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by dehydration or altitude sickness. But she knew, deep in her bones, that what she had seen was real. As darkness fell, Sarah heard footsteps outside her tent. Slow, methodical footsteps that seemed to be moving backward around her campsite. They circled her tent 3 times, then stopped directly outside the entrance. Through the thin nylon, she could see a shadow, the silhouette of someone standing completely still just inches away. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat in her sleeping bag, holding her knife, staring at the tent entrance. The shadow remained there until the first light of dawn, then simply vanished as if it had never existed. The next morning, Sarah hiked out to the nearest road and hitched a ride to the closest town. She abandoned her through-hike attempt, something she had never imagined doing. When she examined her hiking map later, she realized that the section of trail where she had encountered the woman didn't quite match the official AT route. The path seemed to deviate in ways that shouldn't be possible, creating a loop that didn't exist on any map. Sarah never returned to the Appalachian Trail. She sold all her hiking gear and moved to Phoenix, Arizona, choosing to live somewhere with wide open spaces and endless visibility. But sometimes, late at night, she still hears those backward footsteps circling her home, and she knows that whatever she encountered on that Virginia mountain is still aware of her, still watching, waiting for her to return to the trail. She has nightmares where she finds herself walking backwards up an endless mountain path, unable to turn around, unable to see where she's going, becoming exactly what she encountered that October day. And in those dreams, she sees other hikers staring at her in horror, unable to help, unable to understand what they're witnessing, just as she had been powerless to help the woman she saw. Story 2: The Shelter That Wasn't There. Marcus Thompson was 28 years old when he learned that not all structures in the Appalachian wilderness appear on maps, and some places exist in dimensions that don't follow normal rules of time and space. An experienced backpacker from Atlanta, he had hiked significant portions of the AT over 5 years, tackling the trail in week-long sections whenever his work schedule allowed. In late September 2021, he was hiking through the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, planning a 4-day trek that would take him through some of the most remote sections of the trail. The first 2 days had been uneventful and enjoyable. The fall colors were beginning to emerge, painting the mountains in brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold. Marcus made good time, covering nearly 20 miles each day, his legs strong from months of training. He stayed at the designated shelters marked on his map, encountering a few other hikers but mostly enjoying the solitude that drew him to these mountains in the first place. On the third day, around 4 in the afternoon, dark clouds rolled in with startling speed. Within 20 minutes, the temperature dropped 15 degrees, and rain began falling in heavy sheets. Marcus consulted his map and GPS unit, calculating that he was still 5 miles from the next official shelter. In these conditions, with the trail becoming slippery and visibility decreasing, he knew that 5 miles could take 3 hours or more. He pushed forward, pulling on his rain gear and securing his backpack cover. The trail became treacherous, crossing over exposed roots and rocks that were now slick with rain. Thunder rumbled through the mountains and lightning began flashing with increasing frequency. Marcus knew he needed to find shelter soon. Being on an exposed ridgeline during an electrical storm was one of the most dangerous situations a hiker could face. Just as he was considering setting up his tent in the howling wind and rain, he saw it through the trees, a shelter about 30 yards off the main trail. Relief flooded through him. The structure appeared solid and well-maintained with a traditional 3-sided design common to AT shelters. Marcus didn't question why it wasn't marked on his map. Sometimes private shelters or very old structures weren't included in the current guides. He scrambled down the small side trail toward the shelter, eager to get out of the storm. As he approached, he noticed the shelter seemed oddly well preserved, the wood looking almost new despite being in the middle of the wilderness. A small sign hung above the entrance, but the rain made it impossible to read the weathered lettering. Marcus climbed into the shelter, shrugging off his soaked backpack with a grateful sigh. The roof was solid, no leaks despite the torrential rain. The floor was clean, free of the usual debris and rodent droppings common in backcountry shelters. There was even a small pile of firewood stacked neatly in one corner, perfectly dry. As he set about changing into dry clothes and organizing his gear, Marcus noticed something strange. The shelter had a logbook, which was standard, but this one looked ancient. A leather-bound journal rather than the typical spiral notebook. Curious, he opened it to see what other hikers had written. The first entry was dated June 15, 1968. Marcus smiled, thinking it must be some kind of historical replica or memorial logbook. But as he flipped through the pages, his smile faded. Every entry was from decades past, 1968, 1971, 1983, 1995. The handwriting styles changed, but all the entries described seeking shelter from storms just as he had. More disturbing were the contents of some entries. A hiker named Robert Chambers wrote in 1983, "Third night here, can't find the trail anymore. The forest looks different every morning. Food running low. Starting to wonder if I'll ever leave." Another entry from 1995 written by someone named Patricia Vance. "The shelter won't let me go. I've tried to leave 7 times now. Every path just leads me back here. If anyone finds this, don't stay the night. Leave before dark." Marcus felt his skin prickle. He looked outside at the storm, which showed no signs of letting up. The smart thing would be to wait it out, but these journal entries were triggering every survival instinct he had. He decided he would stay only until the rain stopped, then continue to the official shelter marked on his map, even if it meant hiking in the dark. As evening approached, the storm did diminish, but darkness fell with unnatural speed. One moment it seemed like late afternoon, the next it was pitch black outside the shelter, as if someone had flipped a switch. Marcus turned on his headlamp and began packing his gear, determined to leave despite the darkness and his exhaustion. But when he shouldered his pack and walked to the shelter opening, he couldn't find the trail. His headlamp beam revealed only dense forest in every direction, trees packed so closely together that there was no visible path between them. He knew the trail had been clearly visible when he arrived, just 30 yards from the shelter entrance. Now there was nothing but an impenetrable wall of forest. Marcus felt panic rising in his chest. He pulled out his GPS unit, but the screen showed only static, unable to acquire any satellite signal. His phone had no service, which wasn't surprising, but even the compass app wouldn't function, spinning endlessly without settling on a direction. He decided to circle the shelter, looking for the trail from different angles. As he walked around the structure, he noticed something impossible. The shelter had 4 sides. He distinctly remembered entering a 3-sided shelter, open on one end as they all were. But now it was completely enclosed, with wooden walls on all 4 sides and a door that definitely hadn't been there before. Marcus's breathing became rapid and shallow. He was experiencing the beginning stages of panic, and he knew he needed to calm down and think rationally. He went back inside the shelter, telling himself he would wait until morning when he could see clearly and find the trail in daylight. Inside, he lit his small camping stove to make dinner, the familiar routine helping to calm his nerves. As the water boiled, he noticed more details about the shelter that seemed wrong. The wood grain on the walls appeared to be moving, shifting in slow, organic patterns that made his eyes hurt when he tried to focus on them. The shadows in the corners seemed too dark, as if they were holes leading to absolute nothingness. He forced himself to eat, though the food tasted like ash in his mouth. Then he set up his sleeping bag, though he had no intention of actually sleeping. He would stay awake, stay alert, and leave at first light. But exhaustion is a powerful force, and despite his intentions, Marcus eventually dozed off around midnight. He woke suddenly, his internal clock telling him it should be near dawn. But when he checked his watch, only 20 minutes had passed. Outside the shelter, it was still pitch black. This pattern repeated throughout the night. He would fall asleep, experience what felt like hours of rest, wake up thinking it must be morning, only to find that mere minutes had passed. Time had become unmoored from reality, moving at a crawl that was psychologically torturous. During one of these wake periods, Marcus heard voices outside the shelter. Multiple people talking in low tones, though he couldn't make out the words. Relief washed over him. Other hikers must have sought shelter from the storm. He called out, but the voices stopped immediately. Then he heard footsteps circling the shelter, many footsteps, dozens of them walking in a synchronized pattern around and around the structure. Marcus grabbed his knife and headlamp, moving to the door. He yanked it open, shining his light outside. The forest was empty. No people, no animals, nothing but trees and darkness. But the footsteps continued, circling the shelter even though there was no one there to make them. He slammed the door shut and wedged his backpack against it. The footsteps continued for hours, a constant reminder that he was not alone, that something knew he was there. When dawn finally came, real dawn, with light gradually filtering through the trees, Marcus saw that the forest had changed again. The trail was visible, right where it had been when he first arrived. The shelter was back to being 3-sided. And the logbook, which he grabbed to bring with him as evidence, had transformed into a normal spiral notebook with recent entries from this year. Marcus ran. He didn't pack carefully or stick to his planned route. He simply ran toward what his gut told him was north, using the rising sun to orient himself. After 2 hours of frantic hiking, he intersected with the official AT, recognizing landmarks from his map. He didn't stop moving until he reached a road and could hitch a ride back to civilization. Later, when he tried to report the shelter's location to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, he couldn't pinpoint it on any map. The coordinates didn't match any known structure, and when he described the location, rangers told him there had never been a shelter in that area. Some old-timers, however, mentioned rumors of a shifting shelter that appeared during storms. A place where the forest took hikers who were meant to disappear. Marcus never hiked alone again, and he avoids the Cherokee National Forest entirely. But sometimes on stormy nights he wakes up convinced he's back in that shelter, hearing those footsteps circling endlessly, waiting for him to fall asleep one more time so time can slip away again, taking him with it into whatever dimension that place truly existed in. Story 3. The Hiker Who Aged. Jennifer Calloway was 32 years old when she began her section hike through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in early May 2018, and she was 32 years old when she finished 4 days later. But something happened during those 4 days that made her body believe 50 years had passed, and the doctors still have no medical explanation for what occurred on that isolated stretch of the Appalachian Trail. Jennifer was a physical therapist from Asheville, North Carolina, in excellent health and physically fit from regular running and hiking. She had hiked portions of the AT before without incident, and this trip was meant to be a celebration of her recent promotion at work. She planned a straightforward route, covering about 12 miles per day, staying at established shelters and carrying a satellite messenger device for emergencies. The first day went perfectly. The weather was mild, the wildflowers were blooming, and Jennifer felt strong and confident on the trail. She reached Derrick Knob Shelter by late afternoon, finding it empty except for one other hiker, an older man who introduced himself as Thomas Whitfield. He appeared to be in his 70s with stark white hair and deeply weathered skin, but he moved with surprising agility for his apparent age. Thomas was friendly and talkative, sharing stories of hiking the AT back in the 1970s. He told Jennifer he was out for a quick overnight trip, revisiting a section that held special memories. They shared dinner, cooked on their respective camp stoves, and talked as darkness fell. Thomas seemed like a typical older hiker, full of wisdom and trail stories, and Jennifer enjoyed the company. As they prepared for sleep, Thomas mentioned something that struck Jennifer as odd. "Be careful of the gaps in time up here," he said, his expression suddenly serious. "The mountains remember things, and sometimes they make you remember them too, whether you want to or not." Jennifer assumed he was speaking metaphorically, perhaps referring to how being in nature makes people reflective. She wished him good night and climbed into her sleeping bag, falling asleep quickly after the long day of hiking. She woke the next morning feeling strange. Her body ached in ways that had nothing to do with normal hiking soreness. Her joints felt stiff, almost arthritic, and when she sat up, her back cracked audibly. She attributed it to sleeping on the hard shelter floor, though she had done so many times before without issue. Thomas was already up boiling water for coffee. In the morning light, Jennifer noticed something she hadn't seen the night before. He looked younger somehow, his face less weathered, fewer lines around his eyes. She blinked, thinking it must be a trick of the light, and went about her morning routine. As Jennifer packed her gear, she noticed her hands looked different. The skin seemed slightly looser, and she could see her veins more prominently than usual. When she pulled out her small mirror to check her face, she gasped. Fine lines had appeared at the corners of her eyes, lines that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. Her skin looked duller, slightly aged. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the harsh outdoor conditions were just making her look tired. But a seed of unease had planted itself in her mind, especially given Thomas's strange warning the night before. Thomas left the shelter before Jennifer, heading in the opposite direction. As he departed, he looked back at her with an expression that might have been pity or perhaps resignation. "Some people take the years," he said. "Some people give them. That's how the mountain stays balanced." Jennifer stood frozen, her backpack half on, trying to process what he meant. But Thomas had already disappeared down the trail, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for someone his age. Or was he that age? She suddenly couldn't remember how old he had looked the previous night. She shook off her confusion and started hiking. The trail that day took her along a ridgeline with stunning views, but Jennifer couldn't enjoy them. Her body continued to feel wrong. By lunchtime, her knees were aching as if she had arthritis. Her breathing seemed more labored than it should be, even on moderate inclines. And when she stopped to rest and checked her reflection in a puddle of water, she saw more gray in her hair. Panic began to set in. Jennifer pulled out her phone, which had no signal, and then her satellite device. She composed a message to her emergency contact, trying to explain what was happening. But even as she wrote it, she knew how insane it sounded. "I think I'm aging rapidly. My body feels decades older than yesterday. Need help." She almost deleted it, but something made her hit send. The afternoon became a nightmare of physical deterioration. With each mile, Jennifer felt older, weaker. Her vision began to blur slightly. Her hair felt thinner when she touched it. The smooth skin on her hands developed age spots before her eyes. She was experiencing decades of aging in mere hours, and she had no idea how to stop it. By the time she reached the next shelter, Double Spring Gap, she was in severe distress. Moving was agony. Every joint screamed in protest. She collapsed on the shelter floor, too exhausted to even set up her sleeping bag properly. Her reflection in her phone's dark screen showed a woman who looked 60 years old, 50 years of aging in less than 24 hours. That night was the worst of Jennifer's life. She lay in the shelter, feeling her body continuing to deteriorate. Her heart rhythm felt irregular. Her breathing was shallow. She genuinely believed she might die on that mountain, aging to death within days of entering the forest. She activated the SOS function on her satellite device, knowing that rescue would take hours, but hoping she would survive long enough. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, she had vivid dreams. Or were they memories? She saw the mountains as they had been centuries ago, before the trail existed. She saw Native American paths through the forests. She saw early settlers. She saw the construction of the Appalachian Trail in the 1930s. She saw decades of hikers, thousands of them passing through these same mountains. And she understood, on some level beyond rational thought, that the mountains were ancient and had their own way of existing, their own relationship with time. The rescue team reached her at dawn. 2 rangers and a paramedic made the emergency extraction, carrying her out on a stretcher. They were shocked by her appearance, having seen her hiking permit photo from just 2 days earlier. The woman in that photo looked 32. The woman they were carrying looked elderly and frail. Jennifer spent 2 weeks in the hospital undergoing extensive testing. Doctors found that her body showed all the signs of advanced aging: bone density loss, cardiovascular changes, cellular deterioration, hormonal shifts. But it had all happened impossibly fast, with no medical explanation. Specialists flew in from across the country trying to understand the phenomenon. No one could explain it. The best they could offer was aggressive treatment to manage the symptoms. Over the following months, the aging process slowed and eventually stopped, but it never reversed. Jennifer's body remained that of a woman in her 80s, though she was still 32 chronologically. She had to retire from her physical therapy practice, unable to perform the demanding work. Her entire life had been stolen by 4 days on the Appalachian Trail. She became obsessed with finding Thomas Whitfield, the man from the shelter. But no one by that name had registered for a hiking permit in the Smokies that month. No records of him existed at all. She went through the shelter logbooks for that section and found something chilling. Multiple reports over the decades of hikers encountering an older man who warned them about gaps in time, and several reports of hikers experiencing sudden aging, though none as severe as Jennifer's case. One entry from 1992 particularly haunted her. A woman named Dorothy Preston wrote, "Met a young man at the shelter who told me about time gaps. Woke up feeling 60 years younger. Don't know how this is possible, but I feel like I did in my 20s again. almost like I stole someone else's years. Jennifer realized what had happened. Thomas Whitfield, or whatever that entity truly was, had taken her years. The mountain, or something living in the mountain, had transferred decades of her life to someone else, maintaining some kind of twisted balance. She had given 50 years. Someone somewhere had received them. She tried to warn others, posting on hiking forums and contacting the Park Service. But her story was too unbelievable, too impossible. Most people assumed it was a hoax or that she had some undiagnosed medical condition. The official investigation found nothing unusual about the trail section where it happened. Jennifer lives now in a nursing home, her 80-something body unable to function independently. She has decades of life experience that she never actually lived. Memories of aging that happened in compressed time. Sometimes she dreams of the trail, of those 4 days when her life was stolen. And sometimes in those dreams, she sees Thomas Whitfield hiking past her window, looking younger with each passing year, sustained by the stolen time of hikers who were unlucky enough to share a shelter with him on that mountain where time itself had become unmoored from natural law. Story 4. The Parallel Trail. David Chen was an experienced solo hiker who prided himself on his navigation skills, his attention to detail, and his ability to handle unexpected situations in the wilderness. At 41 years old, he had hiked major trails across America, including significant portions of the Appalachian Trail. In October 2020, he was attempting a 10-day section through northern Georgia and into North Carolina, carrying detailed maps, a GPS unit, and a satellite communicator. David was the kind of hiker who studied his routes obsessively before departing. He knew every shelter, every water source, every elevation change. He carried redundant navigation tools and always stayed on marked trails. Safety and preparation were his priorities, which is why what happened to him was so deeply disturbing, because he did everything right. And it didn't matter. The first 4 days of his hike were textbook perfect. David made excellent time, enjoying the cooler autumn weather and the spectacular fall foliage. He reached each planned stopping point right on schedule, staying at shelters that matched his maps exactly. He encountered other hikers regularly, sharing trail conditions and weather updates. Everything was normal, exactly as it should be. On the 5th day, while hiking through the Nantahala National Forest, David came to a fork in the trail that wasn't on his map. The main AT continued to the left, marked with the familiar white blazes. But to the right, there was another path, equally well maintained, also marked with white blazes. This was impossible. The AT doesn't split. There's one continuous trail, one path, carefully maintained and clearly marked. David stopped and pulled out his map, spreading it on a flat rock. According to the map, there was no fork here. The trail continued straight for another 3 miles before reaching a shelter. He checked his GPS unit, which confirmed his position on the map trail, showing no alternative paths. Yet before his eyes were 2 trails, both blazed, both looking official. His logical mind told him to take the left path, the one that matched his map. But curiosity gnawed at him. How could there be a second blazed trail that wasn't on any map? Was it a recent addition? Some alternate route that hadn't made it into the current guidebooks? Against his better judgment, David decided to explore the right-hand path for just a few hundred yards, intending to see where it led before returning to the main trail. The moment he stepped onto the right-hand path, the forest changed. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The light took on a different quality, slightly more amber, as if filtered through old glass. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, wind through leaves, developed a distant, muffled quality, like listening to the world through water. David stopped, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. He turned to go back to the fork, intending to return to the main trail immediately. But when he turned around, the fork was gone. Behind him was only a continuation of the single trail he was on, stretching back into the forest with no sign of the intersection he had just passed through. His stomach dropped. This wasn't possible. David consulted his GPS again. The device showed him on the AT exactly where he should be according to the map, but the landmarks around him didn't match. The trees seemed older, more gnarled. The forest floor was covered in moss that hadn't been there moments before. And most disturbing, the white blazes on the trees looked slightly different. The paint seemed aged, weathered in a way that suggested decades of exposure rather than recent maintenance. He decided the only option was to continue forward on this trail, wherever it led, until he reached a landmark or intersection that would allow him to reorient himself. So David hiked, keeping a careful eye on his GPS, which continued to insist he was on the correct path, even though everything around him contradicted that information. After an hour of hiking, he should have reached Carter Gap Shelter according to his map. Instead, he found a shelter that looked like Carter Gap but wrong in every detail. The structure was the same basic design, but the wood was different, darker, more weathered. The roof had moss growing on it that must have taken years to establish. The logbook inside was water-damaged and ancient. The last entry dated 1987, written by someone named Michael Stavros, who described being lost on a trail that didn't match his maps. David's hands shook as he read entry after entry from decades past, all describing the same experience: hikers who had somehow stepped onto a parallel version of the AT, a trail that looked right but existed slightly out of sync with reality. Some entries were from the 1970s, written by people who mentioned being unable to find their way back to the real trail. The final entry in the book made David's blood run cold. Day 7 on the wrong trail, food almost gone. Haven't seen another living person. The forest is too quiet. Something watches from between the trees. If you're reading this, turn back immediately. Don't stay here after dark. David looked at the sun. It was already late afternoon. He had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. Every fiber of his being wanted to stay in the shelter, to not be alone in this wrong forest after dark. But the warning in the logbook was clear, and the fear in that final entry was palpable even across decades. He forced himself to leave the shelter and continue hiking, pushing his pace to cover as much distance as possible before nightfall. The trail climbed steadily through terrain that should have been familiar but wasn't. The trees were too tall, their branches forming canopies that blocked out too much light. The wildlife was absent. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. Just oppressive silence broken only by his footsteps and labored breathing. As dusk approached, David noticed the blazes on the trees beginning to change. They remained white, but they seemed to glow faintly in the dimming light, pulsing with a bioluminescent quality that was both beautiful and deeply unnatural. He stopped to examine one up close, reaching out to touch the painted surface. The moment his fingers made contact, he felt a shock of sensation. Images flooding his mind of other hikers who had touched these same blazes over the years. All of them lost, all of them afraid, all of them trying desperately to find their way back to the world they knew. David stumbled backward, his heart racing. The blazes were markers, but not for navigation. They were something else. Something that fed on the presence of lost hikers, drawing energy from their confusion and fear. Darkness fell quickly, unnaturally so. Within 10 minutes, the forest went from twilight to pitch black, as if someone had extinguished the sun. David turned on his headlamp, the beam cutting through darkness that seemed almost solid, thick with presence. He kept hiking, not knowing where else to go, knowing only that stopping would be worse. That's when he heard the footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps, matching his pace, staying just beyond the reach of his headlamp. He spun around, shining his light in all directions, but saw nothing. The footsteps continued, constant companions in the darkness, keeping perfect time with his own steps. David began to run, his backpack bouncing painfully against his spine. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out, but the footsteps kept pace effortlessly. Finally exhausted, he stopped in the middle of the trail, bent over with his hands on his knees, gasping for air. The footsteps stopped too. In the silence that followed, David heard breathing. Many voices breathing, surrounding him in the darkness. And then whispers began, dozens of overlapping whispers, all asking the same questions. Where is the real trail? How do we get back? Please help us find the way home. These were the lost hikers, David realized, the ones who had written in that logbook, the ones who had never made it back. They were still here, trapped on this parallel trail, existing in some space between reality and whatever this place was. They weren't quite ghosts and not quite alive, just lost, endlessly walking this wrong version of the Appalachian Trail. David felt tears streaming down his face. "I don't know how to get back," he said to the darkness. "I'm lost too." The whispers stopped. The breathing ceased. For a long moment there was absolute silence. Then one voice spoke clearly, an older man's voice. "You're still alive. You still cast a shadow. Follow your shadow at first light. Don't follow the blazes. Follow your shadow back to yourself." David didn't understand, but he clung to the advice as if it were a lifeline. He waited in that spot for what felt like endless hours, not daring to move, surrounded by the presence of the lost hikers. He didn't set up his tent or even sit down. He just stood there in the darkness, keeping his headlamp on, maintaining the small circle of light around him. When dawn finally came, and he had begun to fear it never would, the forest looked different again. The trees were less gnarled, the moss less pervasive. David turned off his headlamp and observed his shadow cast by the rising sun. Following the whispered advice, he turned his back to the sun and began walking toward his shadow, stepping off the trail entirely and pushing into the forest. For 2 hours he walked through increasingly dense underbrush, always keeping his shadow in front of him as the sun rose higher. He ignored his compass, his GPS, his map, all the tools that had failed him. He trusted only his shadow and the advice from that lost soul. Then suddenly he stumbled through a thick stand of rhododendrons and found himself on the AT. The real AT with fresh blazes and recent footprints. His GPS flickered and then locked on, showing his position. He was exactly where he should be, as if he had never left the main trail at all. But he had lost an entire day. His GPS showed the correct date, but according to his watch and his memory, a full 24 hours had passed. David hiked out to the nearest road that same day, not stopping even to rest. He abandoned his planned route and called for a pickup. When he got home, he tried to process what had happened, searching online for any similar reports. He found scattered accounts buried in obscure forum posts and old blogs of hikers who had experienced missing time on the AT, or who had encountered trails that didn't match their maps. The reports went back decades, all describing variations of the same phenomenon. Parallel trails that existed alongside the real AT, catching unlucky hikers and trapping them in spaces that weren't quite real. David sold his hiking gear and never returned to the Appalachian Trail. But he dreams about it regularly. Dreams where he's back on that parallel path, searching endlessly for the fork that would take him home. And in those dreams he sees other hikers, new victims, stepping onto the wrong trail, making the same mistake he did. He tries to warn them, but he has no voice in these dreams. He has become one of the whisperers, one of the lost, trying desperately to help others find their way back while remaining trapped himself in the memory of that wrong trail. That place that existed between the spaces of reality where time moved differently and the blazes glowed with their own hungry light. Story 5. The Singing Caves. Rachel Kimbrough was a geologist and amateur spelunker who combined her professional interest in rock formations with her love of hiking. At 36 years old, she had explored caves throughout the Appalachian region, always following proper safety protocols and never going alone into unmapped systems. In August 2017, while section hiking through Virginia, she encountered something that challenged everything she understood about both geology and acoustics. Rachel was hiking through the Jefferson National Forest, a section known for its limestone formations and occasional small caves. She had planned a relatively easy 14-mile day following the trail through terrain that should have been straightforward. The weather was hot and humid, typical for a Virginia summer, and she was looking forward to reaching Laurel Creek Shelter by evening. Around mid-afternoon, as she rounded a bend in the trail, Rachel heard something that stopped her in her tracks. Singing. Beautiful, ethereal singing with harmonics that suggested multiple voices blending in perfect resonance. The sound seemed to come from somewhere below the trail, echoing up from underground. As a geologist, Rachel knew that caves could produce unusual acoustic effects, but this was different. This was too perfect, too clearly musical. Curious and professionally intrigued, Rachel stepped off the trail and carefully made her way down the steep slope toward the source of the sound. After about 50 yards of scrambling over rocks and through dense laurel thickets, she found it. A cave entrance, perhaps 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, partially hidden by vegetation. The singing was coming from inside, clearer now and definitely multiple voices, though she still couldn't make out any words. Rachel pulled out her flashlight and examined the cave entrance. The rock formation was limestone as expected for this region, but the opening looked strangely regular, almost carved rather than naturally formed. She should have turned back. She should have marked the location and returned with proper caving equipment and a partner. But the singing was mesmerizing, pulling at something deep in her mind, overriding her usual caution. She called out, announcing her presence, thinking perhaps there were other people inside, though what others would be singing in harmony in a cave in the middle of the wilderness was beyond explanation. No one answered, but the singing continued, seeming to grow more inviting, more insistent. Rachel made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She entered the cave. The passage was tight for the first 10 feet, requiring her to crouch and shuffle forward awkwardly with her backpack catching on the low ceiling. Then it opened into a larger chamber and Rachel stood up, shining her flashlight around in wonder. The cave was more extensive than the entrance suggested, the main chamber about 20 feet across with passages branching off in multiple directions. The walls were covered in unusual formations, not the typical stalactites and stalagmites, but strange geometric patterns that almost looked artificially carved. And the singing was louder here, echoing from deeper in the cave system coming from one of the side passages. Rachel tried to identify the language, but it was nothing she recognized. The melody was haunting, minor key, rising and falling in patterns that seemed mathematically complex. As someone with training in wave mechanics and acoustics, she recognized that the harmonics were wrong. Human voices couldn't produce sounds that precise, that resonant. It was as if the cave itself was singing, the rock formation somehow generating and amplifying the sound. Rachel knew she should leave. Every safety protocol she had ever learned about caving was screaming at her to turn around and exit immediately. But the professional fascination was too strong. She wanted to understand what could cause this phenomenon. She told herself she would just look into the passage where the singing was coming from, just see if there was a natural explanation. She chose the largest of the side passages and followed it deeper into the mountain. The passage sloped downward at a gentle angle, the walls closing in gradually. The singing grew louder with each step, and Rachel noticed something disturbing. The walls were vibrating. She placed her hand against the limestone and felt it thrumming with frequency, pulsing in time with the singing. After about 100 yards, the passage opened into another chamber larger than the first. And here Rachel saw the source of the singing, though her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The entire chamber was filled with formations that looked like organ pipes, vertical columns of stone, hundreds of them, varying in diameter and height. They were vibrating, resonating, producing the singing sounds through some mechanism that defied geological explanation. Air was moving through them, but there was no wind, no obvious source of airflow. The cave itself seemed to be breathing, forcing air through these stone pipes and creating music. Rachel stood transfixed, shining her light around the chamber. The formations had to be natural, but they looked designed, purposeful, arranged in patterns that suggested intentionality. And the singing was even more beautiful here, surrounding her, penetrating into her chest until she could feel her own bones beginning to resonate in sympathy. That's when she noticed the other explorers. In the dancing shadows cast by her flashlight, she saw figures standing motionless throughout the chamber, positioned among the singing stones. At first, her exhausted mind registered them as other cavers, but as she approached the nearest one, horror dawned. They were bodies, mummified bodies preserved in the dry cave air, standing upright among the stone formations. Their mouths were open, their heads tilted back, positioned as if they had been singing. And they were old. Some of them looked decades old, their clothing styles ranging from recent hiking gear to outfits from the 1980s, 70s, even earlier. There were at least a dozen of them visible in Rachel's flashlight beam, possibly more deeper in the shadows. Rachel stumbled backward, her scream echoing through the chamber, merging with the singing stones until it sounded like she had joined the chorus. She turned and ran, not caring about proper caving procedures, just needing to get out. But in her panic, she couldn't remember which passage she had come through. There were multiple openings leading out of the chamber, and in the darkness with her flashlight bouncing wildly, they all looked the same. She chose one and ran through it, her breathing ragged with fear. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, sometimes branching into additional passages. The singing followed her, growing louder rather than fading, as if the entire cave system was one massive instrument and she was now inside it, trapped in its resonance chamber. Rachel lost track of time as she navigated the passages, each one looking like the one before. Her sense of direction completely destroyed. Her flashlight began to dim, the batteries dying after continuous use. Panic turned to terror as she realized she might die down here, might become another one of those standing bodies preserved forever in this singing cave. In her desperation, she began to notice something about the singing. It had patterns, rhythms that repeated, and those patterns seemed to correlate with the passages. Certain tones came from certain directions. The cave was using sound to communicate, or perhaps to navigate. If she could just understand the language of it, she might be able to find her way out. Rachel forced herself to stop running and listen. Really listen. She closed her eyes, removing the distraction of her failing flashlight, and let the sound wash over her. There, a pattern of 3 descending tones that seemed to pull her in a specific direction. She followed that sound, moving slowly, carefully, keeping her eyes closed and her hand on the wall for guidance. The descent tones led her through passages that felt like they were sloping upward. The air became fresher, less stale, and gradually, impossibly, she began to see light. Not artificial light, but the gray light of natural daylight filtering in from somewhere ahead. Rachel opened her eyes and pushed forward, climbing now, scrambling over rocks toward that blessed light. She emerged from a small opening different from the one she had entered onto a steep hillside about a quarter-mile from the AT. She had been in the caves for over 6 hours, though it had felt like both an eternity and mere minutes. She scrambled up to the trail, her legs shaking, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and residual terror. She didn't stop hiking until she reached the next shelter, where she found 3 other hikers setting up for the evening. They took one look at her, covered in limestone dust, wild-eyed, clearly in distress, and immediately offered help. Rachel told them about the cave, about the singing, about the bodies. They listened with growing concern, and one of them, an experienced IT thru-hiker, told her that there were legends of singing caves in this section of Virginia. Stories passed down among hikers about people who heard beautiful music and were never seen again. The Forest Service denied the existence of any significant cave systems in this area, but hikers had reported hearing the singing for decades. They convinced Rachel to report what she had found to the authorities. The next day, rangers came to take her statement and asked her to lead them to the cave entrance. But despite hours of searching, Rachel couldn't find it again. The hillside where she remembered entering looked completely different in daylight, and there was no cave opening visible anywhere in the area. The rangers found no evidence that she had ever been underground. The limestone dust on her clothes was common in the area, they said, and her disorientation was likely due to heat exhaustion and dehydration. But Rachel knew what she had experienced. She began researching, digging through old hiking forums and local historical records. She found scattered reports going back to the 1800s of travelers hearing singing in the mountains of Virginia, of people disappearing near certain sections of what would eventually become the AT. She found mention in a 1923 journal of a musical cave that was deliberately buried by locals who believed it was cursed. Most disturbing, she found a missing persons database and began matching descriptions of disappeared hikers with what she remembered of the mummified bodies in the cave. At least 4 of them matched missing person reports from the past 30 years, hikers who had vanished from this section of the AT without a trace. Rachel filed detailed reports with every authority she could think of, but without being able to locate the cave again, there was nothing that could be done. Search and rescue teams explored the area and found only small, shallow caves with no unusual features. The singing cave, wherever it was, had hidden itself again, or perhaps existed in some space that wasn't quite fixed in normal reality. Rachel stopped hiking. She moved to Colorado, choosing mountains made of granite rather than limestone, staying away from caves entirely. But on quiet nights, especially when the wind blows through the mountains in just the right way, she hears it again, that perfect, impossible harmony calling to her from thousands of miles away, reminding her that somewhere beneath the Appalachian Mountains there are passages that lead to places humans were never meant to find. Chambers where the earth itself sings with voices it has stolen from the lost, adding their final breaths to its eternal chorus. Story 6. The Loop. Trevor Williams was 24 years old and fresh out of college when he decided to spend his summer through hiking the Appalachian Trail before starting his career in software engineering. Young, fit, and perhaps overconfident, he approached the trail with the methodical mindset of someone who saw it as a challenge to be optimized and conquered. He had spreadsheets detailing his daily mileage goals, resupply points calculated to the ounce, and backup plans for his backup plans. What he didn't have was any plan for what to do when the trail itself stopped following normal rules of space and geography. Trevor started his through hike in late April 2019 at Springer Mountain in Georgia, joining the wave of northbound hikers attempting to reach Maine before winter. The first 3 weeks went exactly according to his carefully calculated plan. He maintained his target pace. His body adapted to the daily demands of hiking with minimal issues, and he felt confident that he would complete the entire trail with time to spare. The incident occurred in late May as Trevor was passing through North Carolina, specifically in the section between Wyabald and Wesserbald. It was a beautiful stretch of trail with excellent views and moderate terrain. Trevor had calculated he would cover this section in 2 days, staying overnight at Cold Spring Shelter. He reached Cold Spring Shelter around 4 in the afternoon on the first day, earlier than planned, feeling strong. The shelter was empty, which was somewhat unusual for this time of year, but not alarming. Trevor set up his sleeping area, prepared his dinner, and settled in for the evening. He logged his progress in his hiking journal, noting that he was actually ahead of schedule and feeling good about his pace. The next morning, Trevor woke at dawn as usual, packed his gear with practiced efficiency, and set out on the trail. The day was clear and cool, perfect for hiking. He felt energized and strong as he climbed the steady incline leading away from the shelter. According to his maps and GPS, he should reach Wesser Bald by early afternoon, then descend to Wesser and the Nantahala River by evening. He hiked for what his fitness tracker recorded as 6 hours and 13 miles, maintaining a solid pace. The trail markers and blazes were clearly visible, and the path itself was well maintained. Everything seemed perfectly normal. When he came to a shelter around 4 in the afternoon, Trevor stopped to check his position and take a break, before continuing on to Wesser. He pulled out his map and GPS unit, then felt his stomach drop. According to both, he was at Cold Spring Shelter, the same shelter he had left that morning. But that was impossible. He had hiked 13 miles in a straight line north. He couldn't be back at the same location. Trevor walked around the shelter looking for something that would prove it was a different structure. But there were his own footprints from the previous evening, still visible in the dirt near the fire ring. There was the exact spot where he had hung his food bag, the branch still showing fresh marks from his cord. And most damning, when he checked the shelter logbook, there was his own entry from the previous afternoon. His first reaction was confusion. Then a sort of analytical problem-solving mode kicked in. He must have somehow gotten turned around, misread his map, and accidentally backtracked. But even as he thought this, he knew it was impossible. He had followed the white blazes continuously. The AT is well marked and mostly linear through this section. There were no loops, no confusing intersections where he could have mistakenly reversed direction. Trevor decided the only logical course of action was to try again. He would camp at the shelter again, get a good night's rest, and in the morning he would pay even closer attention to the blazes and trail markers. Perhaps there was some unusual trail reroute that wasn't on his map, or his GPS was malfunctioning. The second morning, Trevor was methodical to the point of obsession. He took photos of each blaze he passed, marked his GPS position every half mile, and paid attention to every landmark. The trail looked identical to the previous day, but he convinced himself that was just because forests all look similar. He maintained his northbound heading according to his compass. The sun rose on his right as it should, and every indication said he was moving in the correct direction. 6 hours and 13 miles later, he arrived at Cold Spring Shelter again. Impossible, yet undeniable. There were his footprints from the previous 2 days. There were his log entries, now 3 of them, 1 for each day. And his GPS, which had been logging his track, showed a perfect 13-mile straight line north from this exact location. Yet somehow he had ended exactly where he started. Trevor felt the first real edge of panic setting in. This violated every law of physics and geography he understood. He checked his equipment obsessively, thinking there must be some malfunction. He took his GPS unit apart and reassembled it, changed the batteries in his compass, studied his map under magnification, looking for some detail he had missed. Nothing explained what was happening. Over the next 4 days, Trevor repeated the hike 7 more times. Each morning he left Cold Spring Shelter, hiked 13 miles north following perfect white blazes on a well-maintained trail, and arrived back at Cold Spring Shelter by late afternoon. His hiking log accumulated entries, each one marking another impossible day. His food supplies dwindled. His mental state deteriorated. The trail itself never changed. Other than the lack of other hikers, which Trevor only belatedly realized was extremely unusual for this section in peak season, everything appeared completely normal. The weather varied day to day, rain one day, clear skies the next, but the trail remained consistent. 13 miles of hiking that somehow curved back on itself in a way that was geometrically impossible in three-dimensional space. On the 8th repetition, Trevor tried something different. Instead of following the trail north, he hiked south, back the way he had originally come. Perhaps he could escape the loop by going backward. But 6 hours and 13 miles later, he arrived at Cold Spring Shelter from the opposite direction, having somehow looped back again despite hiking in the reverse direction. Trevor was now genuinely terrified. He had been trapped in this impossible loop for over a week. His food was nearly gone. He tried to call for help on his phone, but despite showing signal, every call he made was simply dropped after connecting. His satellite messenger showed messages sending successfully, but he had no way to know if they were actually received. He tried leaving the trail entirely, bushwhacking directly east through the forest, thinking he could reach a road if he just ignored the trail completely. He hiked for an entire day through dense forest, using his compass to maintain a straight bearing. But as night fell and he was forced to camp, he heard water running nearby, a creek that sounded familiar. In the morning light, he discovered he had somehow circled back to Cold Spring Shelter and its nearby stream. The psychological torture of the loop began to break Trevor down. Each morning brought hope that maybe this time would be different, and each afternoon brought the crushing disappointment of arriving back at the same shelter. He began talking to himself, then arguing with himself, then eventually stopped speaking entirely. He logged each attempt in the shelter logbook with increasingly desperate and incoherent entries. On what he calculated was the 15th day, though time had begun to feel subjective and unreliable. Trevor decided he wouldn't leave the shelter. He would just stay put, wait for other hikers to pass through and get help. But no other hikers came. Days passed with no sign of another human being. He rationed his remaining food, then ran out entirely. He survived on water from the nearby creek and a handful of edible plants he recognized. Starvation and despair drove Trevor to a kind of resignation. He stopped tracking the days, he stopped logging entries. He spent his time sitting in the shelter, staring at the forest, trying to understand what was happening to him. In his more lucid moments, he theorized that he had somehow slipped into a pocket dimension, a closed loop of space-time that existed parallel to the normal trail. In his less lucid moments, he wondered if he had died somewhere and this was his personal hell, hiking the same 13 miles for eternity. After what might have been 3 weeks in total, Trevor was weakened by hunger and on the verge of complete mental breakdown when something changed. He woke one morning to voices, real voices, not the imagined conversations that had been tormenting him. 2 hikers were approaching the shelter, a couple in their 50s looking fresh and cheerful. Trevor stumbled toward them, hardly believing they were real. They were shocked by his appearance. Emaciated, filthy, clearly in severe distress. They immediately offered food and water, and Trevor devoured it while trying to explain what had happened to him. The couple listened with increasing concern, clearly thinking Trevor had experienced some kind of psychotic break. They convinced him to hike north with them, assuring him that Wesser was just about 13 miles away, exactly where it should be. Trevor agreed, having no other options, certain that they would all end up back at Cold Spring Shelter by afternoon. But this time, something was different. The trail looked the same, but felt different, more real, more solid. The couple chatted normally, pointing out birds and flowers, talking about their hiking plans, being thoroughly, blessedly ordinary. 6 hours later, they emerged at Wesser. Real Wesser, with buildings and roads and other people. Trevor broke down crying. overwhelmed with relief and confusion. The couple helped him to a hostel and convinced him to see a doctor. When Trevor checked the date, he discovered that 23 days had passed since he first arrived at Cold Spring Shelter. 23 days trapped in an impossible loop. 23 days that had nearly destroyed him. The medical examination found him severely malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise physically intact. Psychologically, however, Trevor was deeply traumatized. He tried to explain to authorities what had happened, but the story was too impossible to believe. Search and rescue teams went to Cold Spring Shelter and found his multiple entries in the logbook, which at least verified he had been there repeatedly. But they attributed it to him having some kind of mental health crisis that caused him to wander in circles. Trevor's GPS unit, which should have contained irrefutable evidence of his loop tracks, had mysteriously corrupted all its data from those 23 days. The only remaining evidence was his own testimony and the multiple dated entries in the shelter logbook, which now fascinates and disturbs every hiker who reads it. 15 consecutive entries from the same person, growing increasingly desperate and incoherent, describing being trapped in an impossible loop. Trevor never resumed his through hike. He went home, tried to recover, and eventually started his planned software engineering career. But he's never been the same. He has recurring nightmares of being back in the loop, of hiking those same 13 miles over and over, of arriving at Cold Spring Shelter again and again with no escape. He can't look at maps without feeling anxious, can't hike even short local trails without panic attacks. He obsessively researches topology and theoretical physics, trying to find an explanation for what happened to him. He's found a few academic papers on closed time-like curves and geographic anomalies, but nothing that truly explains a 13-mile loop of hiking trail that somehow curves back on itself despite appearing perfectly straight. Sometimes Trevor wonders if he actually escaped at all, or if he's still trapped in the loop and everything since the couple finding him, the trip to Wesser, his return to normal life, is just another iteration. Another variation of the same impossible day, and eventually he'll wake up in Cold Spring Shelter again, ready to hike the same 13 miles to nowhere, forever. Story 7. The Smiling Hikers. Amanda Reeves was 39 years old, a high school biology teacher from Pennsylvania, who spent her summer vacation section hiking the Appalachian Trail. She had been doing this for 6 years, chipping away at the trail in week-long increments, documenting her adventures in a blog that her students enjoyed following. In July 2016, during a solo hike through central Pennsylvania, she encountered something that made her stop hiking entirely and eventually change careers just to avoid having to explain to her students why she would never return to the trail they knew she loved. Pennsylvania's section of the AT is sometimes called Rock Sylvania by hikers due to the brutal rocky terrain that's murder on feet and hiking poles. Amanda was tackling a particularly challenging section, a 4-day hike that would take her through terrain known for its technical difficulty. She was experienced enough to handle it, though she knew it would be slow going. The first day passed without incident. Amanda made it to Darlington Shelter by evening, finding 3 other hikers already set up there, 2 men in their 20s who were through hiking together, and an older woman doing a section hike similar to Amanda's own journey. They shared a pleasant evening around the shelter, exchanging trail stories and discussing the challenging terrain ahead. The 3 other hikers left early the next morning, heading north, while Amanda took her time breaking camp, planning to maintain her own pace rather than trying to keep up with younger, faster hikers. By mid-morning, she was hiking alone through dense forest, navigating the notorious Pennsylvania rocks that required constant attention to foot placement. Around 11 o'clock, Amanda encountered the first one. A hiker, male, appeared to be in his 30s, wearing gear that looked slightly dated but not unusual, standing completely still about 20 yards ahead on the trail. He was facing Amanda and he was smiling. Not a friendly greeting smile, but a wide, fixed smile that showed too many teeth. A smile that didn't reach his eyes, which stared with unsettling intensity directly at her. Amanda called out a greeting. "Good morning." Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet forest. The man didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there with that terrible smile. She felt uncomfortable but told herself she was being paranoid. Maybe he was taking a break. Maybe he had earbuds in and couldn't hear her. She continued hiking toward him, intending to pass by with a friendly nod. As she got closer, she could see more details. His skin had an odd quality, slightly waxy, not quite the right texture. His hiking clothes, while functional, looked wrong somehow, clean but faded in strange patterns, as if they had been weathered by something other than normal use. And that smile never wavered, never changed, even as she approached to within 10 feet of him. Amanda's instincts were screaming at her to stop, but the trail was narrow here, with dense forest on both sides. To get past, she would have to walk right by him. She slowed her pace, saying, "Excuse me," loudly, giving him every opportunity to move or respond. Nothing. Just that fixed smile and those staring eyes. She made the decision to squeeze past him, giving him as wide a berth as the narrow trail allowed. As she passed, she swore she felt cold radiating from him, as if his body temperature was far below normal. She glanced at him as she went by, and his head turned to follow her movement, rotating with mechanical smoothness, but his body remained perfectly still. And that smile never changed. Amanda walked quickly once she passed him, not quite running but moving faster than the rocky terrain safely allowed. Her heart was pounding and every instinct told her something was deeply wrong. She looked back once and saw him still standing there, still facing her direction despite the distance growing between them, still smiling. She hiked for another hour, trying to calm herself down, rationalizing the encounter as just an odd person with poor social skills or perhaps some disability that affected their behavior. But her unease wouldn't fade, especially as she realized the forest had become strangely quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of her boots on rock and her own breathing. Then she saw the second one. This time it was a woman, younger, maybe early 20s, standing motionless on the trail ahead with the same fixed, too-wide smile, the same waxy skin, the same wrong quality to her clothing and appearance, the same dead staring eyes. Amanda stopped walking. Her rational mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Two hikers, both frozen in place with identical disturbing smiles, both radiating that sense of wrongness. This couldn't be coincidence. This couldn't be normal. She considered turning back, but the male hiker was somewhere behind her. She was trapped between two of them. She decided the only option was to continue forward, to get past the woman and keep moving, hoping to find other normal hikers or reach a road where she could get help. This time, as Amanda approached and then passed the smiling woman, she kept her eyes straight ahead, refusing to look at her. But she felt that same unnatural cold, and she heard something. A faint sound like whispering, too quiet to make out words, but definitely there. Multiple voices whispering in unison coming from the woman's direction. Amanda walked faster, her pack bouncing uncomfortably, her breathing ragged with fear. She hiked for 20 minutes at a pace that was reckless given the rocky terrain, not caring about turned ankles or falls, just needing to put distance between herself and those things that looked like hikers but weren't. Then she saw the third one. Another man, this one appearing older, maybe 50, same smile, same pose, same wrongness. He was standing at a point where the trail turned sharply, positioned so that Amanda would have to pass within arm's reach of him. This time, Amanda stopped completely. She stood there on the trail, her mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. Some part of her recognized that she was in terrible danger, that she needed to make a decision. 3 of these things spread out along the trail, all smiling, all waiting. For what? As she stood there paralyzed with indecision, she heard sounds behind her, footsteps on the rocky trail. Her heart leaped with hope. Other hikers, normal people who could help her make sense of this or at least provide safety in numbers. She turned around, ready to call out a greeting. It was the 2 young men from the shelter the previous night. But they had changed. Their faces were wrong, stretched into those same fixed smiles. Their eyes had taken on that dead, staring quality. They moved with strange, synchronized steps, hiking in perfect unison. Not quite running, but moving faster than normal hiking pace, closing the distance toward Amanda. Behind them, she could see the older woman from the shelter, also transformed, also smiling, also approaching with that unnatural, purposeful movement. Amanda was surrounded. In front of her, the older man blocking the trail ahead. Behind her, 3 more closing in. On both sides, dense forest with heavy underbrush that would make movement nearly impossible while wearing a backpack. She did the only thing she could think of. She dropped her backpack, leaving behind her supplies, her camping gear, her phone and electronics, everything that would slow her down. Then she charged forward at the older man blocking the trail, hoping she could slip past him before whatever was going to happen happened. As she ran toward him, his smile somehow widened even further, becoming almost grotesque, his mouth opening to show teeth that seemed too numerous and too sharp. His arms began to rise from his sides, reaching toward her. And that whispering sound increased in volume, becoming a chorus of voices all saying the same thing over and over. Stay on the trail, stay with us, smile forever, stay on the trail. At the last possible second, Amanda juked to the side, plunging into the forest off the trail. Branches tore at her clothes and scratched her skin. Roots threatened to trip her with every step. She crashed through the underbrush with no regard for direction or safety, just needing to get away from the trail and those things that wore human shapes like masks. She could hear them behind her, moving through the forest with impossible ease, not hindered by the dense vegetation. The whispering voices continued, seeming to come from all directions. Come back to the trail. Smile with us. Stay forever. Come back. Amanda ran until her lungs felt like they would burst, until her legs refused to carry her further. She collapsed behind a large fallen tree, curling into a ball, trying to quiet her gasping breaths. She waited, listening, expecting any moment to see those smiling faces appearing over the log, those hands reaching for her. But gradually the sounds of pursuit faded. The whispering voices grew distant and then stopped. The forest remained eerily silent for what felt like hours. Amanda stayed hidden behind the log, too terrified to move, watching the light slowly change as afternoon moved toward evening. As dusk approached, Amanda finally dared to move. She had no backpack, no supplies, no map or GPS. She was lost in the Pennsylvania forest in whatever direction she had fled, with night coming on. But she was alive, and she was away from those things on the trail. She used the fading light to orient herself, finding a position where she could see the setting sun and determine which direction was west. From there, she could work out roughly which direction would take her to civilization. She stumbled through the darkening forest, moving as quickly as she dared, putting distance between herself and the trail. She walked through the entire night, too afraid to stop, jumping at every sound. As dawn broke, exhausted and dehydrated, Amanda heard the most beautiful sound: traffic. She emerged from the forest onto a highway, probably looking like a trauma victim, scratched and bleeding from dozens of minor wounds, her clothes torn, her expression wild. A passing motorist stopped immediately, shocked by her appearance. The driver, a woman in her 50s, called the police and gave Amanda water while they waited. When authorities arrived, Amanda tried to explain what had happened, but she knew how insane it sounded. Hikers who smiled too much. People who followed her with wrong faces, voices whispering commands. She sounded delusional even to herself. The police searched the area where she indicated finding her. Backpack still sitting on the trail where she had dropped it. Everything inside was undisturbed, her wallet, phone, and supplies all intact. But there was no sign of any other hikers, no footprints except her own in the soft soil near the trail. No evidence of the encounter she described. The official conclusion was that Amanda had experienced a panic attack or perhaps ingested something that caused hallucinations. But Amanda knew what she had experienced was real. She refused to let them convince her otherwise, even as that refusal led to psychological evaluations and concerns about her fitness to teach. Amanda never went hiking again. She eventually left teaching, finding the questions from her students about why she stopped hiking too difficult to answer. She moved to a city, Chicago, where the built environment left no room for forests or isolated trails. She lives in a high-rise apartment building with excellent security, surrounded by people and activity. But sometimes in crowds on city streets, Amanda sees faces in the passing throngs that look almost familiar. Smiles that are just a little too wide, stares that last just a moment too long, skin that has that slightly wrong texture. And she wonders if those things from the trail can exist off the trail. If they can wear their human masks in other places, if they're drawn to her specifically because she escaped them once and they want to finish what they started. She has nightmares where she's back on that Pennsylvania trail, surrounded by dozens of smiling figures, all closing in, all whispering, "Stay on the trail. Smile with us. Stay forever." And in the nightmares, she can feel her own face beginning to change, her smile widening beyond what should be possible, her body freezing into that same terrible pose, joining their ranks, becoming another smiling hiker who stands motionless on the trail, waiting for the next victim to pass by, spreading whatever infection or compulsion or curse transforms living hikers into those eternal, smiling sentinels. Story 8. The Night Hiker. Daniel Moss was a 44-year-old emergency room nurse from Baltimore who had seen just about everything working night shifts in a busy urban hospital. He was unflappable, accustomed to chaos and trauma, confident in his ability to handle high-stress situations. This self-assurance is what made him comfortable with night hiking, a practice most AT hikers avoid. Daniel actually preferred hiking after dark on shorter trail sections, enjoying the solitude and the way the forest transformed at night. His experience with overnight hospital shifts had adapted his circadian rhythm to nighttime activity. In early October 2015, Daniel took a week off work to hike a section of the AT through Maryland, a relatively easy section with moderate elevation changes. His plan was unconventional. He would hike primarily at night, resting during the day, covering ground when the trails were empty in the autumn. Air was cool. He had excellent gear, high-quality headlamps, and years of experience with this nocturnal hiking style. The first 2 nights went perfectly. Daniel reveled in the peaceful darkness, seeing wildlife that daytime hikers rarely encountered. Owls, foxes, flying squirrels. The trail was well marked and easy to follow with his headlamp. He reached his planned stopping points by dawn, set up his tent, and slept comfortably through the daylight hours. On the 3rd night, around midnight, Daniel encountered another night hiker. This was unusual but not unprecedented. He first saw the figure's headlamp about a quarter-mile ahead on the trail, the beam of light bobbing steadily, indicating someone maintaining a good pace. Daniel felt pleased at the prospect of company, rare as it was during his nocturnal hikes. Over the next hour, Daniel slowly gained on the other hiker, his naturally fast pace allowing him to close the distance. He could see more details as he got closer. The hiker appeared tall, with a large backpack moving with smooth efficiency. But there was something odd about the way the person hiked. The pace was too steady, too mechanical, never varying even slightly, never pausing for water or to adjust gear. When Daniel got within 100 yards, he called out a greeting. "Hello? Beautiful night for hiking." His voice echoed through the forest, but the figure ahead didn't respond, didn't turn around, just continued that same metronomic pace. Daniel called out again, louder this time. Still no response. He increased his pace, curious now, wanting to catch up and actually see who this other night hiker was. But as he sped up, the figure ahead somehow maintained the same distance, as if matching Daniel's speed increase despite showing no visible sign of moving faster. This continued for another hour. Daniel would increase his pace and the distance would remain exactly constant. He would slow down, and the gap would neither increase nor decrease. It was as if they were locked together in space, always 100 yards apart, no matter what Daniel did. Daniel started to feel uneasy. He stopped walking entirely, standing still on the trail to see what the figure would do. The headlamp ahead continued moving, slowly pulling away. Daniel waited for 5 minutes, then resumed hiking. Within 10 minutes of walking, the figure was once again exactly 100 yards ahead, as if Daniel had never stopped at all. Now seriously disturbed, Daniel decided to turn around and hike in the opposite direction, back the way he had come. This was south, away from his planned route, but he wanted to see if the figure would follow or if it would continue north. He turned his back on the other hiker's light and began walking back down the trail. For about 30 minutes, Daniel hiked south, checking behind himself periodically. He saw no headlamp, no indication that the figure had turned around. Relief began to wash over him. Whatever that strange encounter had been, it was over. He would hike back to his last camping spot, wait until dawn, and then reassess his route during daylight. Then he saw a headlamp ahead of him on the trail. Going the direction he was now hiking, which was south, there was a hiker ahead. Same distance, about 100 yards. Same steady mechanical pace. Same large backpack silhouette. Daniel stopped walking, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. The figure had been ahead of him going north, and now it was ahead of him going south. Unless there were two night hikers, which seemed impossibly coincidental, or unless... He stood still on the trail, staring at the bobbing headlamp ahead. Then he slowly turned around, looking back the way he had come, which was now north again. There, in the distance, was another headlamp, behind him now. Same distance, about 100 yards, moving toward him at that same steady pace. Daniel was being boxed in. There were two of them now, or perhaps it was the same entity somehow duplicated, one in front and one behind, both closing in on his position. Panic overrode Daniel's usual calm. He turned off his headlamp, plunging himself into darkness, hoping to hide. Without artificial light, the forest at night was nearly pitch black, especially in the dense canopy of the Maryland woods. He carefully moved off the trail, trying to be silent, and crouched behind a large tree. In the darkness, he could still see the headlamps. The one that had been ahead of him continued toward his last position. The one behind him did the same. They were converging on the spot where he had been standing. Daniel held his breath, pressed against the tree, watching. The two lights met at the point on the trail where Daniel had turned off his headlamp. Then they stopped. Both lights went out simultaneously, and the forest plunged into complete darkness. No moon was visible through the canopy, and without lights, Daniel couldn't see anything beyond vague shadows. He waited, his heart hammering in his chest, straining to hear any sound. At first, there was nothing. Then gradually he became aware of breathing. Slow, steady breathing, but wrong somehow, too measured, too rhythmic, like something mimicking breathing rather than actually needing to breathe. The breathing came from where the two lights had converged, right on the trail. And then Daniel heard something that made his skin crawl. Footsteps. Not walking forward or backward, but moving in a circle on the trail, as if whatever it was searching, pacing around the spot where Daniel had disappeared. Daniel realized he was in terrible danger. He had no idea what this thing was, but every instinct told him it was not human despite wearing a hiker's form. He made a decision. He would move through the forest parallel to the trail, heading toward where his map indicated the nearest road should be, roughly 2 miles east. He would bushwhack in the darkness, accepting the risks of injury because staying here was worse. As quietly as possible, Daniel began to move through the forest, one careful step at a time. He kept one hand extended in front of him to detect trees and obstacles, the other hand protecting his face from branches. Progress was incredibly slow and dangerous. He tripped repeatedly over unseen roots and rocks, catching himself as quietly as he could, knowing that any significant noise might give away his position. Behind him, he heard the entity's headlamp turn back on. Then he heard something that destroyed his remaining composure. 2 headlamps turned on. One where the entity had been on the trail, and another one deeper in the forest, roughly in the direction Daniel was moving. They had multiplied again, or perhaps they could teleport, or maybe they had always been multiple entities. Whatever the explanation, he was still being hunted. Daniel abandoned stealth for speed. He ran through the dark forest, protecting his head with his arms, bouncing off trees, falling repeatedly, scrambling back to his feet and continuing. Branches whipped his face. He felt his clothes tearing. The headlamps behind him moved through the forest with impossible ease, dodging obstacles that Daniel couldn't even see, maintaining pursuit with that same mechanical steadiness. He ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. His lungs burned. Blood ran from multiple cuts on his face and arms. He was beyond exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and fear. Then miraculously he saw lights ahead, but different lights, warm and steady. Building lights. Daniel emerged from the forest onto a rural property, someone's home backing up to the national forest. He stumbled across the yard and pounded on the door, not caring what time it was, just needing safety and human contact. Dogs began barking inside. Lights came on. An older man opened the door, shocked to see Daniel's appearance, bloody, clothes torn, wild-eyed. Daniel gasped out a request for help for police, saying he was being followed. The man, to his credit, pulled Daniel inside without hesitation, locking the door behind him. As Daniel stood in the safety of the home's entryway, explaining to the man and his wife what had happened, he looked out the window toward the forest he had just escaped. At the tree line, he could see them. 4 headlamps now, arranged in a row, all pointed toward the house. Watching. Waiting. The lights stood at the edge of the forest for several minutes, then simultaneously turned off, and whatever they were melted back into the darkness. The police came and searched the forest with their spotlights and night vision equipment. They found Daniel's trail of destruction through the underbrush, broken branches, disturbed leaf litter, blood on tree bark. But they found no evidence of anyone following him. No footprints except his own, no sign of other hikers, nothing to corroborate his story of being chased by multiple entities with headlamps. The official conclusion was that Daniel, experienced as he was, had made a judgment error by night hiking alone and had frightened himself, possibly seeing his own shadow or being spooked by animals. The cuts and injuries were attributed to his panicked flight through the forest. But Daniel knew what he had experienced. He never night hiked again. In fact, he had difficulty being outside after dark at all, even in urban environments. He eventually left nursing, the night shifts having become intolerable, triggering memories of that pursuit through the Maryland forest. He took a day shift position at a clinic, restructuring his entire life around avoiding darkness. Daniel researched extensively, trying to find similar reports. He found scattered accounts dating back decades of hikers on the AT encountering mysterious lights at night, of being followed by entities that appeared to be other hikers but weren't. Some reports mentioned lights that multiplied, lights that stayed exactly the same distance away, lights that seemed to hunt. One account particularly resonated with Daniel. A journal entry from 1981 found in an old hiking newsletter described a night hiker who was pursued by lights that thought, and only escaped by reaching a church where he sheltered until dawn. The hiker reported that whatever the lights were, they couldn't or wouldn't come near the church, staying at the property line all night, waiting. Daniel wonders if he survived only because he happened to run toward a residence, toward human habitation and activity. What if he had run deeper into the forest instead? What would have happened if those lights had caught him? Would his body ever have been found? Or would he have become another mysterious disappearance on the Appalachian Trail, one of the dozens of people who vanish without a trace every year? He still has nightmares where he's back in that forest, running through the darkness, hearing that mechanical breathing, seeing those headlamps multiplying behind him, knowing that they're getting closer, that they have all the time in the world, that the forest is their domain and he's just prey that wandered too far from the safety of daylight and civilization. And in his dreams, when they finally catch him, he sees what's behind the lights. Faces that are almost human but missing something essential. Entities that wear the appearance of hikers the way Daniel wears his clothes. A disguise that works perfectly until you look closely and realize nothing is actually looking back through those eyes. Story 9. The Wrong Ridge. Catherine Porter was 51 years old when she experienced something on the Appalachian Trail that challenged her lifetime of outdoor expertise. A professional wilderness guide and survival instructor, Catherine had spent 30 years leading expeditions, teaching navigation, and consulting on search and rescue operations. She knew the AT intimately, having guided clients on sections of it countless times. Her knowledge of trail topology, her navigation skills, and her survival instincts were exceptional, which is why what happened to her in November 2014 on a solo conditioning hike through Vermont was so profoundly disturbing. Catherine was hiking a familiar section of the long trail where it coincides with the AT, preparing for a winter expedition she would be leading. She knew this terrain like the back of her hand. Every shelter, every water source, every prominent landmark. The weather was cold but clear, perfect for a late-season conditioning hike. She planned a straightforward 3-day route covering about 40 miles, staying at shelters she had visited dozens of times before. The first day was uneventful. Catherine made excellent time, reaching Kid Gore's shelter by mid-afternoon. The shelter was empty, which wasn't surprising for late November when most fair-weather hikers had abandoned the trail. She set up her gear, prepared dinner, and settled in for the evening, reviewing the next day's route on her map by headlamp. She woke at dawn, as was her practice, and set out on what should have been a straightforward day of hiking. The trail ascended through terrain she knew well, and Catherine moved with the efficient pace of someone who didn't need to think about foot placement or navigation. She knew she would reach Sunrise Shelter by early afternoon, then could decide whether to push on to the next shelter or stop for the day. But around midday, Catherine realized something was wrong. The ridge she was traversing didn't match her memory. The shape of it, the way it rolled and dipped, the spacing of the trees, all of it was subtly off. She stopped and pulled out her map, confirming her position with her GPS. According to the coordinates, she was exactly where she should be, on the ridge leading to Sunrise Shelter. But the physical reality around her didn't match. Catherine trusted her extensive experience. She had hiked this section at least 15 times over the years. She knew this ridge, and this wasn't it. The elevation profile was wrong. The exposed rock formations weren't in the right positions. Even the vegetation was different. The species mix of trees wasn't quite what it should be. She double-checked her GPS, thinking perhaps it had glitched. But the coordinates were clear. The trail markers were present, showing she was on the AT, and according to every technological and physical indicator, she was in the correct location. Only her intimate knowledge of this terrain told her something was wrong. Catherine decided to continue forward, thinking perhaps she was misremembering or that recent trail maintenance had altered some features. But as she hiked, the wrongness intensified. Views opened onto valleys that shouldn't exist. The ridge seemed to extend much farther than it should. And most disturbing, she encountered trail, junctions that weren't on her map, clear intersections with signs indicating directions, but leading to places she had never heard of despite 3 decades of hiking in Vermont. One sign pointed to Hollow Creek Shelter, 2.3 miles, which wasn't on her map or in her memory. Another indicated Bear Run Gap, 1.8 miles, which also didn't exist in any guidebook Catherine had ever studied. These weren't historical landmarks or outdated names. The signs looked freshly maintained, with recent date stamps indicating they had been serviced just months earlier by trail maintenance crews. Catherine stopped at one of these junctions, studying her map in detail. According to the map, there should be no junction here. The trail should continue straight for another 4 miles without any intersections. But before her eyes was a clear T-junction, with the AT continuing forward and a side trail branching off, complete with signage and recent maintenance markings. Her professional training kicked in. When reality and your navigation tools disagreed, you trusted the tools and adjusted your assumptions about reality. But Catherine had never encountered a situation where her tools agreed with each other but both disagreed with her lived experience of the terrain. GPS said one thing, physical trail markers confirmed it, but her eyes and knowledge insisted she was somewhere impossible. She chose to continue on what the trail markers indicated was the AT, ignoring the side trails to these shelters and landmarks she had never heard of. But as the afternoon progressed, Catherine's unease grew into genuine concern. The trail took her through a notch between 2 peaks that shouldn't exist. The descent on the far side was much steeper than anything on the actual trail profile. And when she checked the time and calculated her progress, she realized she had been hiking for 7 hours but had somehow only covered about 8 miles, a pace far slower than she maintained even on difficult terrain. As evening approached, Catherine accepted that she needed to stop and reassess. She should have reached Sunrise Shelter hours ago, but there had been no sign of it. She wasn't even sure she was still in Vermont. The landscape had taken on characteristics that seemed wrong for the Green Mountains. Rock formations that looked more like New Hampshire's granite, vegetation patterns that suggested different elevation and climate. Even the quality of light seemed off. She set up her tent at what seemed like a decent campsite, though there were no official camping areas marked. As darkness fell, Catherine used her satellite communicator to send a message to her emergency contact, carefully explaining that she was safe but concerned about her position, describing the anomalies she was experiencing. The message sent successfully, showing delivered, which meant the satellites could see her. But where they saw her, she couldn't be sure. That night, Catherine barely slept. She kept hearing sounds that didn't belong in a Vermont forest in late November. Tropical birds that shouldn't exist this far north. Flowing water that sounded like a large river, though no such river existed anywhere near her planned route. Wind chimes that obviously indicated human presence, yet she was supposedly in deep wilderness miles from any residence. At first light, Catherine made a decision. She would ignore the trail markers and her GPS entirely. She would use her compass and the sun to hike due east, which should bring her to Vermont Route 100 within 10 miles regardless of where she actually was on the long trail. Once she hit the road, she could reorient and understand what had happened. She broke camp and began bushwhacking east, using her compass and the morning sun to maintain her bearing. The hiking was difficult through dense forest and steep terrain, but Catherine was experienced and fit. She pushed through underbrush, forded small streams, and maintained her eastward bearing with military precision. After 6 hours of bushwhacking, having covered what she estimated was about 5 miles in a straight line east, Catherine emerged onto a trail. Not a road, but a trail. And not just any trail, it was the Appalachian Trail, complete with white blazes and trail markers. According to her compass, she had hiked due east for 6 hours. But instead of reaching a road, she had somehow intersected with the AT again. Catherine checked her GPS. It showed her at a position on the AT about 15 miles north of where she had left the trail that morning. Except she had hiked east, not north. This was geometrically impossible. She hadn't curved or circled. She had maintained a straight bearing using multiple redundant navigation methods. Yet here she was, back on the very trail she had intentionally left. For the first time in her 30-year career as a wilderness professional, Catherine felt genuine fear. She wasn't lost in the traditional sense. She had navigation tools and they were working. But the space she was moving through wasn't obeying normal rules. She could follow a compass bearing east and somehow end up north. She could hike on a trail she knew intimately and find it transformed into something unfamiliar. Catherine activated the emergency function on her satellite communicator, knowing that rescue would be expensive and potentially embarrassing, but also knowing that she needed outside help to understand what was happening. The device showed the signal being sent, the SOS registering, but no confirmation came back. She tried several times over the next hour, but never received confirmation that her emergency signal was being received. She decided her best option was to continue north on the AT, the direction the trail markers indicated would take her toward civilization. She hiked with focused intensity, covering ground quickly, ignoring the continued wrongness of the terrain around her. Shelter. Signs appeared indicating places she had never heard of. Trail junctions branched off toward mysterious destinations. The landscape continued its impossible variations. Then around mid-afternoon, something changed. Catherine felt it more than saw it, a kind of shift in the quality of reality around her. The light became more normal. The trees started looking right for Vermont. The ridge profile began matching her memory, and within the space of perhaps half a mile of hiking, the trail transformed from the wrong version back to the correct one. She came around a bend and saw a landmark she recognized, a distinctive rock formation called the Elephant's Head that she had used as a navigation landmark many times before. Relief flooded through her. She was back. Whatever wrong place she had been for the past day and a half, she had somehow exited it and returned to the normal AT. 20 minutes later, she reached Sunrise Shelter, the same shelter she had been trying to reach the previous day. There were other hikers there, 2 young men doing a section hike. Catherine almost cried at the sight of them, at the confirmation that she was back in the normal world with normal people on the normal trail. She asked them what day it was, half afraid that time would have slipped as well as space. They confirmed it was November 15th, exactly the date it should be. She asked if they had seen anyone else on the trail in the past few days. They reported passing several other hikers, giving descriptions that sounded perfectly normal. Everything was normal, except for Catherine's experience of the past 36 hours. She hiked out to the nearest road the next day, cutting her conditioning hike short. She filed reports with the Green Mountain Club and the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, describing in professional detail what she had experienced. Her reputation as a serious wilderness professional meant her report was taken seriously, but no explanation could be offered. Search and rescue teams went to the areas Catherine described, but found only the normal trail, normal shelters, normal landmarks. None of the mysterious junctions or shelters Catherine had seen were present. Catherine's satellite communicator data was analyzed. It showed her GPS track for the entire hike, and according to that data, she had never left the AT. Her track showed a normal hiking path, the proper route, reaching Sunrise Shelter on schedule. The device showed no record of her bushwhacking east, no record of the confused navigation. It was as if the device had recorded a completely different hike than the one Catherine experienced. The only evidence that something unusual had occurred was the emergency signal Catherine had sent the first night. That message existed in the system, describing her concerns about anomalous terrain, time-stamped correctly, sent from coordinates that placed her in the right general area. But the follow-up SOS signals she tried to send were never received, showing no record of being transmitted at all. Catherine stopped guiding professionally after this experience. She couldn't in good conscience take clients into wilderness when she no longer trusted that the wilderness itself was stable and consistent. She took a job teaching wilderness survival in a classroom setting, sharing her knowledge without venturing into the forest that had been her life's passion. She still dreams of the Wrong Ridge, that version of the AT that existed somewhere adjacent to the real trail. In her dreams, she takes the side paths to those mysterious shelters with names like Hollow Creek and Bear Run Gap, curious to see what exists in those places. And in her dreams, she meets other hikers on that wrong trail, decades worth of lost souls who stepped into the wrong version of the AT and never found their way back, wandering forever through terrain that shifts and changes, following a trail that goes nowhere, trapped in a topology that doesn't obey the normal rules of space and navigation that Catherine spent her lifetime mastering. Story 10. The Final Blaze. Robert Nathaniel Henderson was 63 years old when he decided to complete his through hike of the Appalachian Trail, a dream he had pursued in segments over 15 years. A retired high school history teacher from Massachusetts, he had saved the final section for his retirement, Maine, culminating at Mount Katahdin. It was September 2013, late in the hiking season, and Robert knew he was cutting it close before Baxter State Park closed for the winter. But he was determined to finish what he had started, to touch that famous sign at the summit and join the ranks of AT completers. Robert was an experienced hiker despite his age, having completed all but this final 281-mile section of the trail. He was fit, careful, and knowledgeable about trail conditions and safety. He had planned this final push meticulously, allowing himself 3 weeks to cover the distance at a conservative pace that accommodated his age and the challenging Maine terrain. The first 2 weeks went remarkably well. Robert felt strong, enjoyed the rugged beauty of Maine's wilderness, and met several other hikers attempting to finish before the season ended. The weather had been cooperative and he was slightly ahead of schedule. By the start of his third week, Robert was only 4 days from Katahdin, 4 days from completing his 15-year journey. That's when he noticed the blazes changing. The Appalachian Trail is marked with white rectangular blazes painted on trees, a simple universal marking system that has guided hikers for nearly a century. Robert had followed these blazes for thousands of miles over 15 years. He knew them as well as he knew anything. But as he hiked through the 100-mile wilderness, the most remote section of the entire AT, the blazes began to look different. The change was subtle at first. The white paint seemed slightly off in shade, perhaps more cream-colored than pure white. Robert attributed this to age and weathering, though he noted that trail maintenance in Maine was generally excellent. By the next day, the difference was more pronounced. The blazes had definitely changed color, now appearing distinctly cream, almost yellow-tinted, and they seemed to be slightly larger than standard, the rectangular shape stretched taller. Robert stopped to examine one closely, running his fingers over the painted surface. The texture was wrong. Not paint on bark, but something smoother, almost like the marking was part of the tree itself rather than applied to it. Robert checked his map and GPS, confirming he was still on the AT. The trail itself was well maintained and clearly the correct path. But those blazes were wrong, and as he continued hiking, they kept changing. By afternoon, they were distinctly yellow. By evening, they had taken on an orange tint. That night at the shelter, Robert mentioned the changing blazes to two other hikers staying there. They looked at him with confusion, insisting the blazes were normal white as they always were. Robert took them outside with his headlamp to show them, but in the beam of artificial light, the blazes did indeed appear white. He felt foolish, apologizing and attributing it to his aging eyes, perhaps perceiving colors differently in different lighting. But the next morning, in clear daylight, the blazes were undeniably orange, and they were definitely larger, now almost double the size of standard AT blazes. Robert was certain of what he was seeing, but he was also the only one seeing it. The two other hikers had already left the shelter when he woke, and he was hiking alone through increasingly remote wilderness. As the day progressed, the blazes continued their transformation. By midday, they were bright orange, the color almost glowing against the dark bark of the trees, and Robert began to notice that they were appearing more frequently. Standard practice was to place blazes at intervals where hikers needed guidance, at turns, intersections, or regular intervals on straight sections. But now, Robert was seeing them every 20 feet, then every 10 feet, then every tree had one. The trail began to feel claustrophobic, hemmed in by these increasingly frequent orange blazes. And Robert realized something deeply disturbing. The blazes were no longer just markings. They had dimension. They protruded slightly from the tree trunks as if growing out of the bark, organic rather than painted. By late afternoon, the blazes had turned red, deep crimson red, the color of blood, and they were pulsing. Robert stopped walking, staring at the nearest one, watching it slowly throb with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. He placed his hand against his chest, feeling his heart rate, then watched the blaze pulse in perfect synchronization. Terror began to override Robert's rational mind. He was 4 days from Katahdin, in the middle of the 100-mile wilderness with limited exit options, and the trail itself was transforming into something impossible. He considered turning back, abandoning his 15-year dream just days before completion. But turning back meant at least a week of hiking, and the trail behind him was marked with the same disturbing red blazes. Robert forced himself to continue forward. He was committed now. The only way out was through. He hiked with growing dread as the blazes continued their transformation. By evening, they were dark red, almost black, and they had grown to cover significant portions of tree trunks. And worst of all, they had begun to develop texture. Not smooth like bark or paint, but textured like skin, like flesh. That night, Robert couldn't bring himself to stay at the designated shelter. The blazes there were enormous, covering entire sides of the structure, pulsing obscenely. He set up his tent off-trail, far enough from the path that he couldn't see the blazes, though he could feel them, their presence pressing against his consciousness, even hidden behind trees and distance. He didn't sleep. He lay in his tent listening to sounds he couldn't identify. Wet, organic sounds like breathing or digestion, coming from the direction of the trail. In the morning, he broke camp quickly and returned to the trail, knowing he had to keep moving forward. The blazes on day 3 of this nightmare were no longer red. They had turned black, but a black that seemed to absorb light. Holes in reality marking the trail. And they were moving. Robert watched them slowly sliding along tree trunks, migrating from tree to tree, spreading like some kind of infection through the forest. Every tree along the trail was becoming marked, the black spreading across bark, killing the living tissue beneath. Robert hiked as fast as he could, desperately covering ground, no longer caring about pace or conservation of energy. He just needed to reach Katahdin to complete the trail and escape whatever was happening. He passed through a ball bridge, the traditional last resupply point, barely stopping except to refill his water. The few people there looked at him with concern, noting his wild-eyed appearance, but Robert couldn't explain what he was experiencing. He simply pushed on toward Baxter State Park. On his final day, the day he should reach Katahdin's summit, the blazes had become something indescribable. They weren't marks on trees anymore. They existed in the air, floating along the trail like three-dimensional shadows, leaving trails of darkness that slowly faded. The forest around the AT had died. Every tree marked by the black blazes was lifeless, the leaves fallen, the bark peeling, as if the blazes had drained the life from them. And Robert realized what was happening. The blazes weren't guiding him to Katahdin. They were feeding on him, on his determination to complete the trail. They were some kind of entity that existed symbiotically with the AT, drawing energy from hikers' desire to finish, their need to reach the end. The closer a hiker got to completion, the more desperate they became, and that desperation was food for whatever the blazes truly were. Robert understood that thousands of hikers completed the AT every year without experiencing this. So why him? What had he done differently? And then he realized it was his 15-year journey, his obsessive dedication to finishing. His dream of completion that had fed the blazes, given them strength. They had grown fat on his determination, and now in his final miles they were revealing their true nature, no longer needing to hide. But Robert had come too far to stop. Even knowing what the blazes were, understanding that reaching the summit would complete some kind of cycle that would give them what they wanted, he couldn't turn back. The need to finish was too strong, had become part of his identity over 15 years. He was trapped by his own determination. He climbed Katahdin in a state of dissociation, barely aware of the physical challenge, his mind focused only on reaching the summit. The blazes surrounded him on all sides now, not just marking the trail but enclosing it, creating a tunnel of darkness that led inexorably upward. Other hikers on the mountain appeared as distant ghosts, existing in a different reality where the blazes were still normal white rectangles and the trail was just a trail. Robert reached the summit at dusk, touching the famous Katahdin sign with numb hands. He had done it. 15 years, 2,190 miles, countless sacrifices and challenges, and he had completed the Appalachian Trail. The achievement felt hollow, meaningless as he stood surrounded by blazes that had grown to cover the entire summit area. Pulsing with satisfaction, gorged on his years of determination and dreams. That's when Robert noticed something that made his blood freeze. The summit sign itself was marked with a blaze. Not painted on it, but part of it, the wood grain transformed into that same light-absorbing black. And carved beneath the standard summit text was additional writing, fresh and raw. The trail is never complete. The blazes go on forever. Follow them home. Robert looked north, off the summit of Katahdin, where the AT officially ends. And there, descending the north face into wilderness where no trail should exist, was a line of black blazes. They continued into the distance, marking a route that wasn't on any map, extending beyond the end of the trail into territories unknown. A compulsion gripped Robert. He had followed blazes for 15 years, for thousands of miles. The blazes guided hikers. You followed them. That was the rule. The contract between trail and hiker. And these blazes led north beyond Katahdin, and they wanted him to follow. Robert took a step toward the north face, then another. The need to follow the blazes was overwhelming, bypassing rational thought. operating at a level below conscious decision-making. He was a hiker. The blazes marked the trail, therefore he would follow them. He descended the north face of Katahdin as darkness fell, following the black blazes into wilderness. Behind him, confused park rangers at the summit tried to call out to him, but their voices seemed to come from very far away, from a world he was rapidly leaving behind. Robert Nathaniel Henderson never returned from Katahdin. His car was found at the trailhead, his personal effects left at his last lodging in Millinocket. An extensive search found no trace of him on the mountain. One ranger reported seeing someone matching his description descending the north face at dusk, but a search of that area found nothing. No footprints, no signs of passage, no body. The official conclusion was that Robert had fallen somewhere on Katahdin and his body had simply not been recovered. A tragic end to a successful through hike. But some local Maine guides and longtime Baxter State Park employees tell a different story. They mention that sometimes in certain light at dawn or dusk, you can see blazes on the north face of Katahdin, marking a trail that isn't supposed to exist. And very occasionally, hikers report seeing an elderly man in the distance, always descending, always following marks on trees, never stopping, never reaching whatever destination the blazes promise. Trapped forever in the act of following, of hiking, of never quite completing the trail that has no end.